Welcome to the Pitbull Patty Show. This season, we're inviting you to take the Lit Grit Challenge by reading great literature just 1 hour a day, 52 books in 52 weeks to give you the grit you need to succeed. Hey everybody, welcome to the Pitbull Patty Show. I'm Patty Stuckler, along with my son Connor. And we got such a great book. Oh my gosh.
You say that every week.
Okay, well, do I say it every? I don't know. I just they're like children to me. We're doing Tipping Point by Malcolm Gladwell this week. Some of you hopefully have read it. I read it actually like 15 years ago for the first time, whenever it came out. It's been a long time. But I reread it in anticipation of doing this episode, and wow. I just love the psychology of this book. It's just so cool. What do you think?
I think it's a great book. Well, what's interesting is because, you've recommended I read a couple of Malcolm Gladwell books, like The Outliers, Tipping Point. Blink, yeah. And I never read them, and I started to read one, and I didn't get into it. But then he was actually a guest on Joe Rogan's podcast. So I listened to that, which was really interesting. He was actually talking about his new book, Talking with Strangers, or Talking to Strangers, which I don't know if we're going to read that. Read it?
Okay. Well, I haven't read it yet, but I'd like to.
Yeah, but it was really interesting, and I just thought, wow, he really takes these little things and like dives in on kind of the minutia, which I thought was really interesting. Mm-hmm. And then it led me to look up his podcast, because he's got a podcast as well, and I think I went to the wrong one, because I actually listened to one of his like commencement speeches.
Oh, really?
I guess he's got two, where one he's got past speeches he's done, and then he's actually got like his podcast. Mm-hmm. And he talked about, and it was really interesting because it was something that's in the book, the power of context. He was talking to these real estate developers, which is actually why I listened to it, because it was about real estate. Mm-hmm. And it was just talking about the importance of your surrounding and how it affects people's behavior, which I thought was really interesting. Mm-hmm. And then having read this book, he covers that.
So lots of studies.
Yeah, it was very interesting.
I think because we'll talk about the power of context, but I thought it was super cool because in the beginning he talks about Paul Revere. Mm-hmm. And Paul Revere, for people who don't remember quite the story, but...
The British are coming.
Yeah, well, yeah, the Midnight Ride, okay? But still, some people may not realize. But the 1775... Paul Revere, silversmith, a little boy comes to him that works in a stable in Boston and had heard these British army men talking about, we're going to march, there's going to be hell to pay. Yeah, exactly. So Paul Revere then goes, meets up with other, revolutionary guys and come up with a plan. They decide to go out on a ride. So he rides northwest towards Lexington, sets out at like 10 o'clock at night, and, with the message of the British are coming, right?
Yeah.
So he goes to town, he goes knocking on the doors, he gets the church bells ringing and the drums playing, and the towns are all alerted because the British were going to Lexington to actually come after John Hancock and Sam Adams.
And get the storage of the guns.
Yeah, collected. In Concord. Then they would go from Lexington to Concord and seize all the guns and ammo they had. Yeah, the militia had there. So that was the plan. So he goes out and does all that and is wildly successful. Mm-hmm. Goes over 40 miles, all those towns. And so the next morning... they're ready. They're ready for the British, and they kick their butts, and so it was awesome. Yeah. But what was so interesting, and that people don't always know, and probably most people don't, that there was actually another guy besides Paul Revere that set out on that same ride, except he was going just west, and that was William Dawes, was another revolutionary fella, and he set out with the same exact message: the British are coming. And he didn't rouse the troops, so to speak. He didn't.
Yeah, I think it said that only like one town even responded, and they were too late to even be of any help.
Yeah, so they were not prepared for the British Army, and he just was not successful.
Right.
He didn't. So it begs the question: why are some messages or some ideas spread like a virus, like his did, like Paul Revere's did? And some don't. And really, the answer was that it was the messenger. It wasn't, it was the same message.
Right.
But it was the messenger. Mm-hmm. So, what do you think about,
Well, yeah, and just to take a little bit of a step back, the part of this book is it's kind of about social epidemics, like why things spread and how they reach that tipping point, and then they go from just a few people to, everybody. So that's a little bit of the context of the Paul Revere thing. And I just thought it was interesting because he talks in the book. They talk about the 3 different kinds of people, and there's 3 principles. It's
well, as far as social epidemics, he's talking about there's 3 principles. You got the law of the few.
The law of the few.
The stickiness, which has to do with
factor.
the message.
Yep.
And then the power of context. The first part when he's talking about the law of the few,
right,
is when he's talking about like
the 3 different kinds of people that make up the law of the few, and he talks about the 6 degrees of separation too,
not to get ahead, but he talks about the types of people like Paul Revere was.
Right.
You have connectors, mavens, and salesmen.
Right.
And these are highly unusual people. They're not like the normal average person.
Right.
They are, they have an ability to connect people, to be very socially engaging and belong to many different groups. So they have a really powerful way of being able to spread word of mouth epidemics.
Right. And so the thing that the book looks at with Paul Revere is that he was actually 2 of these 3 kinds of people. He was a connector, so that's part of the reason why he was so wildly successful. He was part of all these different social groups, so as he's riding through all the towns, he knows who to talk to get the message out, and where they are, where they live, who's the local militia leader of this town. Mm-hmm. So that was one factor, and then the other was that he's a maven, and you might be wondering, what the heck's a maven? Which is what
Not
I was
a raven.
thinking. Right. And a maven is basically a collector of information. And so, because he was a connector and a maven, that stable boy even knew to go to Paul Revere because he was the kind of person that, was a collector of that kind of information.
Well, I always think of it, too, as really mavens are people that really want to help people. So they're not just people who know a lot of people, but they're they like to teach. They're really good teachers, but they also have that other element of being very socially engaging and involved, like a connector. Right. So to me, they're very similar.
Well, what's funny about that, too, is he gives another example of a maven, and it's this guy, I think he was in Texas, and he's like, oh, you got to go to this person to get your car fixed, and you got to go to this grocery store to get this, and
stay at this hotel. And
right, exactly.
This is what you need to order at the restaurant at the hotel.
So they're a collector of information, but really they want to help people. That's how they get their gratification from it.
Yeah.
But what's funny is, I thought of my Aunt Terry and her cutting coupons. She's like, oh, you got to go to Safeway on Thursday to get this and that, and that's she's kind of a maven when it comes to grocery store coupons. I guess.
I would say Tommy C is a little bit like that too. Kind of always,
hey,
go here.
Well, that's what I said that to you the other day.
There's specials of this, and you got to try that, and you got to talk to this guy.
He's a little bit of a Paul Revere himself.
Yeah.
He's a connector. He knows lots of people.
I thought it was interesting, like in the book, in reading about Paul Revere and then reading about connectors and mavens and salesmen, it made me think about the Book of Habits that we've already covered.
Yeah.
That Rosa Parks that I liked so much, that when they were talking about Rosa Parks, I realized in reading this, wow, she was a true connector and maven, and that is why the tipping point, because as we talked about in that, there was other people who sat where they weren't supposed to sit in that time, legally and whatever, and then got arrested even as much as 10 years earlier than Rosa Parks, also in the same area. So why did Rosa Parks, why did it tip? Why did that epidemic spread? It was because Rosa Parks belonged to all these different groups, not just one, and most people...
in the church and the knitting groups and the school groups, helped out with the kids. And
also she was involved with white families where she made dresses, like prom dresses, I guess. They weren't called proms, but whatever, debutante type dresses for white families, and she was very well respected, very well liked, and knew all these people. And so
she'd have been a perfect case study for this book.
Oh, absolutely. I'll have to let Malcolm Gladwell know when he revises the next revision, he can add Rosa Parks in there.
That's so funny.
So that was super interesting. So I want to look at my notes because this book is just chock full of like so many different psychological studies.
Well, what I thought was interesting too is so the third person is the salesman, and that's somebody who's gonna basically sell your message and get it to infect as many people as possible, and then that is a big tipping point too. But one of the things I thought was really interesting was one of the examples he gave of the salesman type, and he talked about this financial advisor, and that it's not just the script. He said you could after meeting with the salesman, he just felt like totally engaged with him, and like, man, he could have, you know, got him to sign whatever. And it wasn't just his words, but it was actually, you know, his body language and how it kind of lulled people into kind of like a rhythm and a dance with the person, and that's how he was so persuasive, which I thought was really interesting, and something I was like, well, I need to kind of incorporate that with, you know, selling houses.
You need to learn to dance.
Yeah, walk and dance.
Okay, more than just the shoulders.
Okay.
More than just shoulder
Will
rolls.
Duvall.
No,
Fill
so
with the shoulders.
yeah, I thought that was super interesting, and he talks about like he talks about the 6 degrees of separation, which you kind of mentioned. I think,
Yeah.
about the people, like the study where they had 160 people in Omaha where they like sent them a package, and then they had to write their name on it and get that package to a stockbroker. And this was in the 60s. This is before internet and all that.
Before
obviously.
Amazon Prime.
Yeah, before everything. And it had to get to this stockbroker in Massachusetts.
Right.
And so what they found was that it would take 5 or 6, on average, 5 or 6 steps, hands. Go. How does words spread or information spread through a society? And this is, again, back before the internet, so and social media and all that jazz. But it would take 5 or 6 people, and that's where that 6 degrees of separation came in.
Yep. And then what's interesting too with that was that he found like half of these 160 packages that got delivered came through the hands of like 3 or 4 people. So what was interesting was that the 6 degrees of separation, but it's not all created equal. There's people that are much more interconnected than others, whereas like the normal person might only have a few connections, but then one of their connections is one of these kind of super connectors that then, you know, branches to lots of different people.
Well, and if you think about it, most people have like a certain group, like say they're a big golfer, so they know a lot of people who golf, and then that's, you know, or somebody who lives in a big apartment building, they know a lot of people who live in that apartment building, and so they have friends either by proximity or by their activities.
Right.
And that's true for most people. So they're limited. But then you have these set few who have so many different groups and are so socially adept that they can, you know, navigate through a lot of different societies.
Be the bridge between a bunch of different social circles.
Yeah. So he also talks about stickiness, this, you know, the message itself.
Right. Yeah.
You know, what makes something more interesting. Now, the British are coming. That doesn't sound like, I guess, that's sticky, but maybe back then.
Well, I think that would be sticky because it's extremely relevant to, I mean, their colonies being kind of oppressed, whatever, by the British monarch, and so that, I mean, the British are coming would be pretty sticky.
Yeah, I guess so.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't think the stickiness factor was as interesting as the law of the few or the
power of context.
I really thought the power of context was really interesting.
Yeah.
And like how you talk about the power of habit with respect to being a maven and a connector with Rosa Parks, I thought the power of context made me think about that company Alcoa and how they started with, you know, making safety a priority and then the huge ripple effects it had. So when they talked about the power of context, and there's 2 parts of the power of context, but one of the things that it was so interesting was about the New York City subways and how there was a crime epidemic and, you know, it wasn't safe and people were getting mugged and, you know, robbed and beaten and, you know, sometimes even killed. And but how they basically started to address that was not, you know, hey, we're going to go after the high profile muggings and everything. What they started was with the graffiti, and it tied back into that broken glass principle, which is a thing in psychology where, you know, your environment, if there's a bunch of broken glass and graffiti, you're more prone to actually commit crimes and do those things because of the environment. And that's the first part of the power of context, which I thought was super interesting. That by focusing on graffiti and then later fare jumpers, people who weren't paying their fare and just jumping over the turnstiles, they actually were able to totally transform the New York City subway and make it, you know, what it is today, which is very safe. And I mean, having lived in New York with, you know, Rose, my fiance, and I mean, I never felt unsafe on the subway. And I know when I moved up there, you were like, you're going to get mugged.
I don't remember saying that.
You were worried about me moving to New York City. You didn't say you were going to get mugged, but you were definitely worried about it because, it was obviously known as very unsafe during the 80s. And, but yeah, I mean, I thought it was great. I never felt unsafe. And
well, the thing that was interesting to me was Malcolm Gladwell talks about...
Then again, I'm a big strapping young man.
He talks about the 1980s New York City, it was really, really crime-ridden. It was just a terrible place. Nobody was safe there. And he talks about 1984, the Bernard Goetz, however you say his name, where and I remember that because I graduated high school in 83. So in 84, I mean, I was like 19 years old or whatever.
Yeah, I was -8.
And I can remember that story. And what happened was Bernard Goetz, he was on the subway and he had a gun, which, I mean, was kind of crazy. And he's just like this really nerdy looking accountant type guy. Mm-hmm. And these 4 young guys ended up like messing with him, you know, like gonna rob him, whatever. And there was other people on the train car, a couple of ladies, and he was, you know, they were just taunting people and really whatever. Yeah. And he shot them. He shot these 4 kids, went to trial, and then was basically hailed as a hero and was seen as a vigilante, He what's so fascinating to me is I read that and it was like refreshing my memory, and I'm thinking about today, you know, 2020, and you're thinking, that would never happen today. It would never be viewed.
He certainly wouldn't be viewed as a hero.
It would not be viewed as a hero at all. And it just tells you how bad that subway system was, and that no one paid. People were always jumping the turnstiles and not paying, and it was.
Well, what's interesting too is because he does talk about that story, and you know, not that that'd be justified. You know, shooting people's, you know, very rarely justified. But they did have like screwdrivers in their pockets. You know, they were trying to rob him when he did shoot him. So I mean, it was in self-defense, you know, to a certain extent, but. He also came on the subway with a gun, so I kind of feel like he was looking for trouble a little bit. So it's an interesting story, and you know, especially in the lens of viewing that same story today, it would be viewed
crazy
much
when you think
differently.
about it.
So
wow,
it's pretty fascinating.
It's super fascinating. I thought it was just really, really interesting, especially because I remember that time, and it's like the thing about it is when they decided to focus on a small thing. Instead of, when you think about the magnitude of the problem, this horrific crime all over, no one wants to ride the subway because it's so
there was like, 2,000 murders a year?
Yeah, it was the crime rate was just astronomical, and they were, you know, murders, rapes. I mean, they weren't just little crimes, they were big crimes. So to focus on something so small as graffiti, which, of course, all the train cars were just filled with graffiti. Right. So what they did was, the police decided, okay, they were going to scrub every car, and and they had cars that would go to Harlem to the end of the line, and then if it was a graffiti car, what they would do was they would paint it all over, send it back out, and they wouldn't send any car back out unless it was totally repainted. Clean, So then the car would go back to the end of the line, the kids would come out there. It would take 3 days for them to do the type of graffiti that they did, which that was interesting too. Yeah. They would literally
come at night, 3 nights in a row.
Nights in a row they'd paint it like white, I guess, to get the base, like almost like a real artist. It's quite fascinating. And then they would do all the outlines the second night. Then on the third night they would do all the color. Right. So they would do this beautiful masterpiece in their minds, obviously. Yeah. Some of it is quite interesting. And then they'd send that car back out there, and boy, that car, they wouldn't send it out, but
they'd have it painted over.
They'd have it painted over and send back out, and so these kids would spend 3 days of their life, or nights of their life, doing all this work, only to have it just painted right back over, so they stopped doing it. Right. Of course, you're going to stop doing it. And the same kind of thing with the beating the fares, they would start arresting people left and right, and they would make it really expedited. They got to the point where they could do it so quickly, and then they would find that like 1 in 5 or something of all the fare beaters
would have a weapon or
would
a
have
gun.
A weapon. They would have
I think 1 out of every 20 had a gun, and then 1 out of every 5 had a warrant or something like that.
I mean, it was crazy. So they were like actually solving other crimes very quickly and catching criminals.
And again, I think that's really interesting in today's context because I tend to feel like, man, giving people a record for a $2.50 fare is kind of ridiculous. So I kind of tend to go the opposite way and say, man, you're now making it harder for that person to get a job because now they've got a criminal record because of a $2.50 fare, you know? But it's so fascinating to see that by focusing on that, it actually had the ripple effect of preventing all these larger crimes. So it's really interesting because it puts me in kind of a tough position because on one hand, a bleeding heart.
Yeah,
liberal.
but that would be a very minor misdemeanor. It would be like a traffic stop or getting
I know, but
speeding.
but that's why New York has gone to like the no bail system, which I don't
think
agree
that's
with. I don't agree with. But
yeah.
it is does disproportionately affect people, lower income people that then sit in jail or go to Rikers for something that's really small that anybody else would be able to pay a $300 cash bail and get out. So I do understand. I don't know. It's a delicate dance. But I just thought it was interesting.
Well, it just
back
shows
then, and then like if you try to do that now, because I mean when I lived in New York, there were people jumping fares all the time, and they really didn't police it.
Well, I mean, it's been proven time and time again that the small things like the
right.
alcohol,
It's definitely it's very very. I just think it's interesting. I mean,
you take one small thing.
You guys got to read these books.
You do because, and in fact, if you read these books, because I think you were saying the other day when we kind of talked about it a little bit already about. In fact, sometimes we have some really interesting conversations
that don't make it on the podcast.
Yeah, because by the time we've already talked about it a little bit, sometimes we need to make sure not to talk before we sit down and do the podcast because. You were saying something about how that this book isn't really a self-help book.
Right.
Remember we were talking about that, and you were like,
I just think it's like when I started reading it, I was like, well, I kind of almost lost interest in it, even though it's a super fascinating book because I'm kind of on this like personal development path, and so I started reading it, and I was like, it's kind of not exactly the genre or whatever. Yeah, but then as I kept reading, it really it's just a fascinating book, and it's really more about like sociology and psychology and for me in like personal development with my career and everything, the salesman bit really spoke to me. But I just thought it was it was super interesting. I thought the power of context was so fascinating, and to tie it back to what I was talking about when I listened to his lecture at a commencement speech. Because he was speaking at a real estate development like graduation class in Miami, and he was talking about the architecture and the buildings that you build really do affect the community and affect the people and how they act. And he actually talked about the Golden Gate Bridge and how there's all these. It's like the number one bridge for like suicides, and obviously that was an unintended consequence, but. The buildings you build and the environment that you surround yourself really do have an effect on your behavior, which I thought was super interesting. And then further, the second part of the power of context was, not just your physical surroundings, but the people you surround yourself with. Mm-hmm. And I always thought that was interesting because you talked about, I know we've talked about this before, but like when I'm around my parents, my mom and my dad, they've got these big personalities. So I'm usually a little quieter, more reserved around my family. But then when I'm in some of my other friend groups, I am that gregarious person and loud and more outgoing. And so it's
so
very.
So you become your parents.
I didn't say that. Did not say that.
No. I think it's very true. What fascinated me, out of all of it, to me, I thought about how important a really small detail can be, and if you change the right small thing. What an impact it can have on your life. So
like quitting smoking, like what's her name in Power Habit?
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, I was thinking and that's why it is a self-help book. If you look at it in that context, if you say, well, how can I apply this to my life? So when I was rereading this,
I like personal development, not self-help.
Okay, well, whatever. So whatever. So I thought about it and thought, okay, well, how can I apply just a small thing? So I thought about, okay, my relationship, with your dad. I was thinking, well, how about if every morning I give him a kiss and start my day, just a nice quick kiss and a hug and start my day. And I started implementing that. And it's so interesting how one small thing, that's just a small thing, just, a kiss, first thing in the morning. And it's because working with your dad, working together. I'm having a hard
time believing that this is actually
I know you're probably a little creeped out too, but
I'm just very skeptical.
No, I mean, you know how it is. We work together, working with your dad and working with family all the time. It has its own certain challenges, and when it comes to your relationship with your spouse, then it can be you see your spouse a little bit too much like
a coworker.
Your coworker, that drives you crazy. You know what I mean? And so yes. I decided, okay, I'm going to implement that, and I noticed a shift. I noticed that it's it softens, his behavior, and I just started doing
nag that to start your morning? Doesn't put you in a bad mood?
Hey, so so I mean, so isn't that interesting? You know, so you can play around with that idea of it's just the idea of well, what small change can I make in my business? What small change can I make in my relationship or in my life or my habits or whatever? And see the domino effect that it can have, the big effect.
Yeah, it's great, and I think that's the great thing about these books is you see parallels between these things, and they reinforce each other even though they're taking a totally different look at it. Like I wouldn't say there's that much
be about
between
habits.
Right. Yeah, I would say there's very little overlap. But then when you once you start to read it, you start to see these trends and these parallels, and it kind of reinforces that hey, this isn't a bunch of bullshit. This is legit, and you can look at it a bunch of different ways. And that's what I think is great about all these books, too, because The Power of Habit might not click for some people, but the tipping point, you could read it and then take away that, hey, maybe I need to not nag so much.
Hey, whatever works.
I'm just kidding.
No, I think another thing, just kind of in trying to wrap it up, the FAE, which was the fundamental attribution error. I don't know how you thought about it, but what he talks about in that, and that was also in the Power of Context section of the book. Yeah. But he talks about how, like, when you look at another person and you think, wow, well, Joshua is a really honest person. That's how I see him. So it's almost like they're one-dimensional then in your mind. Like you have
like they're static.
Or the reverse. Oh, that person really is, whatever, some negative attribute. Right?
And like that person's a liar, but that doesn't mean they're always lying. That means, or that person's really honest. But that in certain contexts, that person may not be always honest. And it's not so black and white, and that there's a lot of gray.
Yeah, and if you change their environment, that same honest Abe all of a sudden becomes... a cheater like a lot of people. And so people you put them in a different context. And in fact, one of the stories I really liked was he talked about I think it was Princeton University did a study about the Good Samaritan kind of effect.
Oh yeah, that was interesting.
That was super interesting.
There were a bunch of seminarians that were the test subjects.
Yeah, I know. It was so crazy. So they have a theological seminary, who knew, at Princeton, at least back then. I don't know now. I don't know when this was, in fact.
You know what? When I was at Princeton, I didn't.
So, me either. But yeah, it was a seminary, just to kind of lay it out. It was a seminary with these seminarians. They were part of a test that they didn't realize, part of an experiment. Right. And they were told, okay, you're going to go over to this building and you're going to, however, it was close enough to walk. You're going to go there and you're going to give this speech about of all things, the Good Samaritan. And if you remember the Good Samaritan, it was it was I think it was in the Gospel of Luke, and this traveler is traveling and he gets robbed and beaten and left for dead on the side of the road. And then a priest and a Levite come by. So two people you would think that would actually help, and they did not help. They literally passed by this, and it took this Samaritan, which Samaritans were part of a minority group that was kind of despised and not well respected. And it was actually a Samaritan that then bandaged the person and took care of them and helped. So this is what these seminarians that are training to be priests.
I think it's a great example. It illustrates the power of
context. Probably better than any story in there, I thought. So they go and they got to go to give this speech. Now, they would tell half the group, okay, you're gonna, you're gonna have plenty of time, and you can get there early, whatever. So they tell them you got plenty of time. They go walking, and 63% of those, which I was a little surprised wasn't higher than that, to be honest with you. But if you're gonna go give a speech on the Good Samaritan, and then you have time, and you say only 63%, but it still was a high number, more than half. Yeah, so about 2/3 stop and help a person who was already intentionally set there to be the victim that needed help. Then they told the other half of the seminarians, hey, you're running late. You're already late. It started early and they're expecting you, and you got to get over there. You got to get over there. Only 10% of this that were on their way to give a speech about the Good Samaritan actually helped this person that was clearly in need and was on the way to where they were giving the speech.
So on the surface, you'd think the overwhelming majority of these people would help, but that small change in their context, hey, you got plenty of time or you're running late, had a huge drastic effect.
Totally. That one small thing. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
One little tiny variable that then changed. It was the tipping point.
Yeah.
So time actually was the tipping point that changed behavior. So it's a fascinating look on our own lives. And if you kind of take some of this information and you go, wow, how these kinds of variables change your own behavior, you can kind of watch out for it a little bit more when you're aware of it.
Absolutely.
I don't know. Super fascinating. So we'll wrap this up, and we gotta talk about
what's the next book?
The next book just happens to be handy. The Anagram Made Easy. This is a really super easy read. Obviously, just like it says, Made Easy. I mean, it literally even has pictures. So you'll love this book, Connor. But The Anagram Made Easy, and it's by Renee Barron and Elizabeth
Warren.
Waggles, what?
I said Elizabeth Warren.
Oh my gosh, Elizabeth Waggles. Anyway, it says
discover Native American.
Oh my gosh, discover the 9 types of people. So you will figure out which one you are of the 9. It's my favorite of the personality types of assessments that you can do, and there's plenty out there like DISC and lots of others. But to me, this is a great one and an easy read, and will be so much fun to talk about.
Yeah, and you can read this book and just start analyzing all the people around you and your family members, and you're such a 9.
Yes. So anyway, this has been fun. Enjoyed it.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, have a great week. 1 hour a day. That's all you need to do. 1 hour a day. You should be able to knock it out. And this one probably less than that, right?
Yeah. That's what I'm looking forward to.
All right. So we'll see you next time.